Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight you're not a warrior. You're not a chieftain, a monk, or some chainmail-clad brute waving a sword around for glory. You're a child, Irish, clever, and unfortunately gifted, with a memory like a steel trap and a mouth that won't stay shut. You don't know it yet, but you've already been marked. You won't farm, you won't fight, you won't ever really belong to yourself. Because tonight you're going to be a bard. And in medieval Ireland, that's just a poetic way of saying state-sanctioned hostage with a memory palace for a skull. Before they shut you in a pitch-dark hut and start chanting at you until your dreams rhyme in strict syllabic meter, do me one small favour. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing who's tuning in from around the world. And if you'd like early access to more of these soothing nightmares, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to help keep this odd little history channel going, you'll find the Patreon link in the description. But for now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. You don't remember the moment your fate was sealed. It wasn't a thunderclap or a vision in a dream. No one painted your face blue or held a flaming sword above your head. No, it happened quietly, probably on a damp morning, the fire barely lit, and you sitting cross-legged on a packed earth floor, repeating a story an elder had just told. You got the cadence right. You remembered all the names. You even mimicked their tone, down to the dramatic pause before the punchline. Someone raised their eyebrows. That was it. You were marked, not because you were the smartest, not because you were the bravest, but because you could speak, and more importantly, because you could remember. In a world where most people can't even write their own names, memory is a dangerous gift. You're not sent off to war. You're not sent to a monastery. You're not left to chase pigs through the misty fields or haul seaweed up from the rocks like everyone else. Instead, you're pulled aside. There's no asking, no contract, no moment where someone leans in and says, "Would you like to dedicate your entire existence to the service of kings and the destruction of reputations through weaponized verse?" They don't ask. They just assume. Your parents are probably thrilled. It means food, education, a future. For them, for you, it means a slow transformation into something no longer quite human. You're going to become a bard. And in medieval Ireland, that means living memory, political instrument, spiritual intermediary, and legally sanctioned insult machine. You're still young when they begin testing you. They tell you a story once, just once, and expect you to repeat it back perfectly. Not the gist, not the outline. Every syllable, every shift in tone, every internal rhyme. And you do, not because you're magical, but because your brain has never had a chance to forget. You're still blank enough to absorb. They push you harder. Say this faster, say it backward. Switch the final words in every line and see if it still holds the rhythm. It becomes a game, but not the fun kind. More like intellectual Hunger Games, except the only thing that dies is your sense of self. No one tells you exactly what a bard is, at least not in the beginning. They just start treating you like you already are one. You sit in on recitations. You're forbidden from writing anything down. That would be cheating. Everything must be stored in your mind. Like a sealed vault, you're not allowed to leave. The older students chant late into the night, their voices echoing through the dark like incantations. You hear their breath catch when they forget a line. The way the silence stretches like a threat. You're not allowed to ask questions. You learn by repetition, by imitation, by fear. If you're lucky, you'll be broken in early. If you're not, you'll crack later, and no one's going to pause the training for your little collapse. You start to realize that this isn't just a job. This is a sacred office wrapped in thorns. In Irish society, bards are second only to kings in status. Sometimes they're more powerful. They're exempt from taxes. They're guaranteed hospitality. If someone kills a bard, it's a major legal offence, sometimes even a mortal curse. That sounds nice in theory, but it also makes you a lightning rod. You carry a blade in your mouth, and everyone knows it. Nobles fear you. Commoners adore you. Enemies want to silence you. And every time you open your mouth, you're gambling with consequences that might not show up until months later, when the wrong person finally gets offended. What makes it worse is that none of this is optional. You don't get to say, actually, I'd rather be a fisherman. Once you've been chosen, your body's no longer just yours. Your mind is a public archive. Your voice is a tool of the tribe. You belong to a complex, ancient social mechanism that treats language the way other cultures treat weapons. And unlike a sword, you can't just lay your tongue down when the battle is over. You sleep with it. You bleed through it. You carry it for life. By the time you're old enough to understand what's really happening, you're too deep to get out. Your days are structured like monastic orders, only instead of praying, you're reciting. Instead of copying manuscripts, you're building entire memory palaces in your skull. You memorize genealogies stretching back dozens of generations. You learn complicated poetic forms that would make modern linguists cry. You chant meter patterns in your sleep. And when your masters correct you, they don't just frown, they scorch. A single misplaced syllable in a formal recital is not an error. It's a sin against the tradition. And you feel the weight of that every time your mouth opens. There are no medals, no grand initiations, just more verses, more forms, more sleepless nights. You start to feel the creep of something permanent under your skin, a voice that isn't entirely yours anymore. It's the voice of the tradition, the school, the tribe. It whispers, even when you don't want it to. When you hear someone lie about history at a feast, your pulse spikes, because the knowledge in your brain doesn't tolerate contradiction. It must be spoken. It must be set right. You are no longer allowed to forget. And yet, people bow when you enter a hall. They pour you wine you didn't ask for. They offer you the warmest seat by the fire and the most flattering company. They call you master before you even feel like one. You learn quickly. This is not respect, it's fear. They're afraid you'll write about them, that you'll remember them, incorrectly, mockingly, cruelly. And if you do, there's no fixing it. Once the words are spoken, they live forever, passed down like a hereditary disease in rhyming couplets. You haven't even been trained yet, and already you feel the weight of that responsibility sinking in like winter rain through your boots. So no, you weren't chosen for your strength. You weren't chosen because you could swing a sword or churn butter or die nobly in battle. You were chosen for something much worse. Your ability to remember pain, shape it into beauty, and then weaponize it in front of a crowd. You were chosen for your tongue. And in medieval Ireland, that's the most terrifying kind of power you can hold. It starts with a door, wooden, heavy, creaking on its hinges like it resents having to open for you. Behind it, there's no grand library, no desk with quills and parchment, no kind-faced teacher offering you a warm drink and gentle instruction. What waits for you is darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, not emotional darkness. Actual physical darkness, total and intentional. You step inside and the door shuts behind you with a sound that feels permanent. The air is close, the smell is damp earth, sweat, and old straw. Welcome to your education. You're going to be here a while. There's a term for this stage of training, Fili, the poet in making, but don't let the title fool you. This is less school and more memory crucible. There's no writing aloud. You won't see a page of text for years. Light is considered a distraction. The logic is brutal and simple. If your eyes can see, your mind will cheat. And so they blind you, not with violence, but with architecture. You live in a space where your senses are starved of everything except sound. You sleep in the dark, you eat in the dark, you listen endlessly to the chants of your master. Verses so intricate they make legal codes look like children's rhymes. The first few weeks are disorienting. Your brain rebels. You reach for patterns where there are none. Try to visualize words that refuse to form pictures. The chants come in waves, long, rhythmic, and hypnotic. You begin to notice things. The exact way your teacher's breath catches before a pause, the slight shift in pitch when he recites a particular lineage, the musicality of the consonants, the mathematical regularity of the syllables. It doesn't sound like language anymore. It sounds like a spell being cast over and over with you at the centre. Your job is to listen, that's it, but not passively. You must absorb, repeat and internalise. The verses are never written down, not even for the masters. They carry them in their skulls like relics. The idea is simple and horrifying. If a true bard can be killed, the tradition cannot. The knowledge survives through duplication. You're the next copy in the chain, and they don't particularly care if you break in the process. Many do. Some go mute, some go mad. A few run off into the forest one night and are never spoken of again. They say it takes 7 years to train a bard. That's generous. Real mastery takes 10. A full decade of this, of silence, shadows and song. There are ranks to pass, forms to master, genres of poetry so complex they make modern sonnets look like refrigerator magnets. Each has its own rules for syllable count, rhyme scheme and metre. You learn to recite not only poetry, but law, genealogy, medical chants, and history, all encoded in poetic form to make it stick. It's a hard drive without a keyboard. You must speak everything into being, and remember it forever. When you make a mistake, and you will, they don't beat you. That would be crude. Instead, they correct you, slowly, methodically, over and over. You chant it again, and again, and again, until it's right. Until it lives inside you, twitching like muscle memory. You learn to think in metre, to hear the natural rhythm of language even in conversation. Normal speech begins to sound off-tempo, discordant. You start rearranging it mentally, like furniture in the wrong room. You can't help it. Your mind has been tuned to another frequency, and now everything else feels out of key. Eventually, your ears sharpen. You can hear another student stutter from across the room. You can detect flaws in a recitation by breath alone. You begin to take a strange pride in it. Not joy, not satisfaction, but the grim, tight-lipped pride of someone who's endured something most people wouldn't survive. You've passed the threshold. You've adapted. And that's when they start to test you. They give you new verses late at night, after you've already gone hoarse from chanting. They wake you from sleep and demand recitations on command. They have you compose verses on the spot in unfamiliar meters, under pressure, while the other students listen. You're not just memorizing now. You're creating. You're performing. You're learning to control the fear that creeps into your throat every time you speak aloud in front of someone, with the power to unmake your progress in a single word. Occasionally, a visitor arrives, a travelling olim, a noble sponsor, a wandering judge of verse. When that happens, the room changes. The students become still. The air grows heavy with anticipation and dread. You might be chosen to recite in front of them. If you do well, you'll be remembered. If you falter, you'll be remembered differently. Every guest is both an opportunity and a potential executioner of reputation. You learn to speak like your future depends on it. Because it does. Outside the hut, the world continues its endless damp chaos. Clan feuds, cattle raids, marriage bargains, and plague. You wouldn't know. You see almost none of it. Your world is interior. You live inside words, you dream in verse. You forget your own voice and replace it with the voices of 100 dead poets, whose lines you now carry like bones in a rucksack. You're not a person anymore, not in the usual sense. You're an instrument being tuned for something sharp and public. You're becoming a bard, and it hurts. But then one day, after years of echo and effort, something shifts. You don't notice it at first. Maybe a younger student stumbles on a line, and you instinctively correct them. Maybe you overhear your master referencing a verse, and you realise, without effort, that you know the next 6 lines by heart. Maybe you're asked to recite a genealogy in public, and you don't feel your stomach twist. You open your mouth, and it flows out like water from a spring that's always been there. You've changed. You didn't just memorise it, you became it. That's when they finally let you see light again. Not metaphorical enlightenment, actual literal sunlight. They open the door, it blinds you. You blink at the brightness like a mole emerging from a lifetime of tunnelling. The world looks new, colder, sharper. Every leaf is too green, every sound too loud. You've been in the forge too long. You are not the same metal that went in. This is where the second phase begins, what modern people might call a field assignment, except yours involves far more fear and far fewer bed linens. You're not alone, but you're also not protected. Your presence is both welcome and watched. Some lords treat you with amusement, others with suspicion, but all expect you to remember. Their names, their victories, their ancestors, their enemies, every syllable counts. You're expected to perform, sometimes with little warning. A few stanzas at a wedding, a lineage correction at a land dispute, a recitation of tribute obligations during a feast, always precisely, always in the right tone. You are never told which tone is right, only punished when it's wrong. During this phase, your mistakes aren't just corrected, they're noted, gossiped about, compared to your peers. You start to understand that bardic training isn't just memorization. It's surveillance of you and by you. You're both student and spy. You are meant to impress but not outshine. Support but never slip. Your superiors test you constantly. They feed you false genealogies to see if you catch the error. They ask you to improvise a quatrain under pressure. They ask you to mimic a rival school's cadence and then criticize you for doing it too well. You don't complain, you nod, you recite again. Over time, you lose count of how many verses live inside you. Hundreds, thousands, some from 100 years ago, some from last week. You begin dreaming in metrics again, not from panic, but because your mind has nothing else to do. The darkness may have ended, but the discipline hasn't. Your thoughts must remain ordered, symmetrical, recitable. By now, most of your peers have quit. Some never made it past the dark hut. Some never adjusted to travel. Others faltered at their first public mistake and vanished into other trades. Scribes, messengers, even priests. But you remain, because whether you admit it or not, this is the only shape your brain now fits. Poetry is no longer a craft. It's how your memory functions. One day, without announcement, someone refers to you as a bard, not a student, not a trainee, a bard. You don't feel ready, but you don't correct them either. You recite what's required. You get it right. You no longer need the dark hut, because now you carry the dark inside you, the discipline, the silence, the focus, and the words shine just as sharply as they did in the pitch-black world where you first heard them. Under Brehon law, the legal system that governs everything from cattle theft to blood feuds, satire occupies a terrifying space. It is both protected speech and a recognised form of punishment. You can't just walk into a courtroom and accuse someone of injustice without evidence, but you can compose a satire that strips them of honour, legally and spiritually. A successful satire is considered a blow to a person's reputation so severe that it reduces their status in the eyes of the community, and in some interpretations, in the eyes of the gods. It's not metaphorical damage, it's tangible, with legal and sometimes financial restitution attached. You are, essentially, licensed to humiliate. And humiliation is no small thing in this society. Honour is currency. A chieftain without honour is no longer a chieftain. A king mocked in verse is a king weakened. And since kings are believed to rule by sacred right, a successful satire doesn't just make them look silly, it undermines their divine legitimacy. If the land starts failing, if the crops wither or the rains vanish, people might whisper that your words broke the bond between king and land. Satire doesn't just stick, it festers, it spreads, it rewrites how a person is remembered. And once the words are out, they cannot be unsaid. The form matters too. Satire in bardic tradition isn't a string of random insults. It must follow strict poetic rules, specific meters, syllabic precision, rhyme schemes, and internal consonants. If you're going to ruin someone's life with verse, it had better scan properly. The more elegant the satire, the more devastating the blow. Sloppy insults are just noise, but when crafted well, your satire becomes an incantation, a perfectly balanced cultural attack that satisfies both the legal structure and the supernatural one. You don't just say someone is a coward. You imply that their lineage has decayed, that their cattle miscarry, that even the land rejects them. And if your words are precise enough, everyone else will believe it too. Because that's the terrifying part. People believe it, not just socially, but physically. There's a long-standing tradition that a powerful satire can cause actual harm. Skin welts, rashes, facial blemishes. There's an Irish word for this. A poetic curse that disfigures its target. Whether through psychosomatic suggestion or divine wrath is beside the point. Enough people report it to make it matter. You're told stories of lords waking up with festering boils after being satirized. You're warned that satire might even kill, if not the body, then the soul's place in the social order. And that's a kind of death all its own. This power doesn't come without danger, because while you're legally allowed to use satire, you're also responsible for its accuracy. Satirizing someone falsely is itself a serious offence. You can't just make things up for the sake of a clever rhyme. If your satire accuses someone of cowardice, treachery, theft, or corruption, it had better be grounded in truth, or at least widely accepted rumour. If not, you become the criminal. A false satire is slander, and slander by a bard is a profound breach of trust. In a society where memory and speech function as law, your mouth is held to a standard higher than any written contract. So you learn restraint. You learn to compose in your head, to feel the pulse of a satire building, and then to shelve it unless absolutely necessary. Most bards will go their entire lives without performing more than a few full satires, but the threat of satire, that's used constantly. You learn to clear your throat meaningfully. You learn to pause before a line, just long enough to make the room wonder if you're about to ruin someone. You learn to accept bribes, flattery, gifts, not because you've demanded them, of course, but because those in power know what you're capable of, and they'd rather be on the receiving end of praise than a footnote in one of your devastating little epics. And then there are the subtler forms. You don't always have to go full nuclear. A backhanded praise poem can do just as much damage, especially when your audience is clever enough to hear what's missing. You mention the chieftain's lineage, but not his deeds. You praise his generosity, but leave a suspicious silence where his bravery should be. You describe the feast, but skip the battle. Everyone hears it. Everyone understands. You never spoke a lie, but you told the truth in such a way that it howled like a wound. Of course, this also means your own tongue becomes a liability, not just for others, for you. A bard who loses control of their satire becomes a menace. You've heard stories of bards exiled for reckless insult, stripped of status, even executed for destabilizing political alliances. Satire is not a game. It is a sanctioned, sacred, and deadly serious art. You are permitted to humiliate the mighty, but only if you can prove they deserve it, and only if the satire itself is flawless. You walk a razor's edge every time you speak in verse. One misstep, and the power you wield will fold inward like a knife. You're also reminded quietly that you can be satirized too. It's rare. Most bards follow a code of professional restraint. But should you rise high enough to challenge others, you may find yourself the target of poetic retaliation. The air grows cold when two masters of satire square off. You don't shout, you don't duel, you recite, the audience holds its breath, and someone walks away with their pride in tatters. So yes, you're a poet. Yes, you speak in rhyme and meter and ancient forms. But don't confuse that with softness. You are, in the eyes of the law and the gods, a wielder of a sacred and supernatural force. You do not carry a sword. You carry a tongue sharpened by years of darkness and discipline. And when you choose to speak, when you choose to strike, the world listens, the world recoils, the world remembers. By now you've learned to recite 1,000 names without blinking. You can recall the lineage of a minor chieftain back 27 generations, complete with birth order, marriage alliances, territorial claims, and one unfortunate incident involving a goat and a disputed boundary stone. It's not just a party trick, it's your job. In a society where writing is rare and literacy is mostly reserved for monks, your memory is the official record. You are the archive, the court transcript, the legal contract. If you say it, it happened. If you forget it, it didn't. There is no higher authority than a perfectly recited genealogy. You don't just preserve the past, you enforce it. In disputes over land, inheritance, or honour, people call on you. Not a priest, not a judge, you. Because you remember what was sworn, what was promised, and who stood as witness. And unlike ink, your memory can't be smudged or burned. Your authority rests on something more terrifying than law: reputation. If you've trained properly, if you've passed the tests and recited before the right people, then your word becomes legal precedent. When you open your mouth, a dozen clans hold their breath. This makes you invaluable. It also makes you dangerous. Everyone wants you on their side. Chieftains offer you food, land, jewellery, even lovers. All they want in return is a few favourable verses and the convenient omission of a cousin's unfortunate betrayal during last year's cattle raid. You learn to smile politely. You learn to nod non-committally. You never agree aloud, but you never quite say no either. Because the minute you take a side too openly, your memory becomes suspect. And a bard with compromised memory is a broken instrument. But neutrality is a lie. You can't serve power and remain untouched by it. Every feast you attend, every patron you praise, every omission you quietly make, it all reveals your allegiances. You find yourself composing verses in your head as you listen to arguments unfold. One lord claims his great-grandfather was promised the marshland. Another swears he has the right of conquest. You recall the song of the old treaty, the phrasing buried 6 stanzas deep, the clause no one else remembers. And when you finally speak, you do so not as yourself, but as the living voice of memory. Sometimes your role becomes even more intimate with politics. You're invited to courts not just to perform, but to observe. Everyone knows a bard is listening, and that knowledge alone changes how people behave. The tone of a negotiation shifts when you walk into the room. People choose their words more carefully, or they don't, and give you something even better. You don't ask questions. You simply sit there, sipping wine you didn't request, quietly cataloguing every boast, every half-truth, every pause that says more than a sentence could. You're never explicitly called a spy. That would be rude, but make no mistake, your presence is strategic. You are the listening ear of your patron, the sharp tongue wrapped in silk. When tensions rise between two clans, a bard is often the first sent ahead. Not a soldier, not a herald, but you. Your job is to observe the mood, assess the tone of the court, and report back in language so layered it could pass for poetry, even as it condemns a dozen men. You're fluent in subtext. You hear things people don't even realise they're saying. And when you speak, everyone listens for what you didn't say. There's a reason you're housed so well, fed so richly, treated with wary reverence. You carry secrets the way a warrior carries blades, close, quiet, and ready. And people know it. You've heard entire hallways fall silent when you enter. You've seen lords stop mid-sentence at the sight of you. They remember your last satire. They remember the way you described that other chieftain's warband, how you made them sound like dogs yapping at a feast. You never insulted them directly. You didn't have to. Your words are scaffolding, and people hang their own guilt on them. Of course, this kind of power makes you a target. Some want to buy your silence, others want to win your favour. A few would prefer you vanished entirely. You learn to travel with subtle guards, or at least with allies who owe you favours. You stay in well-lit places when possible, and you never drink too much at unfamiliar tables. Poison is rare, but not unheard of, and more than one bard has woken up in a ditch, their tongue swollen and useless, a warning, not a murder. You may be sacred, but you're not immortal. Even within your own ranks, you must tread carefully. Other bards are not necessarily your friends. They are your rivals. They're watching for any slip, any lapse in memory, any flaw in your verse structure they can exploit. And they'll do it with style. You've seen it before, a casual correction during a feast, a footnote slipped into a praise poem that subtly undermines your credibility. You're not just preserving history, you're competing to control it. And the battlefield is always moving. You learn to hedge your words, to praise broadly without specifics, to record things in multiple ways, each tailored to a different audience. A treaty might be sung one way in the hall of your patron, and entirely differently in the company of his enemy. You're not lying, you're interpreting. That's what you'll tell yourself anyway. But deep down, you know the truth. Memory is not objective, not in this world, and certainly not in your mouth. Still, for all the duplicity and danger, there's something holy about it. You sit in a smoky hall, the fire crackling low, and the entire room leans forward as you begin to speak. You name their ancestors. You tell them who they are, and who they've been, and who they might become. In a world without books, your voice is the only way the past can survive. And that's the strange paradox. You are a tool of power, yes, but also a guardian of continuity. You hold the past so tightly, it bleeds into the present. And if you ever let go, the whole house collapses. So no, you're not just a poet. You're not just a singer. You are the law's memory, the tribe's conscience, and occasionally its most cunning instrument of espionage. You walk into every room knowing more than you say. And when you speak, you do so not as yourself, but as the collective voice of everything this land remembers, and everything it wants to forget. You might think that surviving 10 years of darkness, mastering a language more tightly coiled than Latin, and learning to recite lore and legend without blinking would be enough. It's not. In the bardic world, mastery is just the beginning. What comes next is a long, narrow ladder with splinters in every rung. A hierarchy so rigid, it makes a feudal title chart look relaxed. Every poet, every bard, every would-be memory keeper is sorted into ranks, strict, ceremonial, and unforgiving. Climb it wrong, and you'll fall. Climb it too fast, and someone will make sure you fall harder. It begins with Folklock, the bottom rung, a beginner, a poetic child in the eyes of the court. You might be clever, you might be promising, but you're still just an apprentice, kept on a tight leash by your master. You're allowed to recite simple forms, short verses, minor stories, mnemonic aids for more important men to quote. No one expects much from you, except silence, deference, and obedience. Most importantly, you're not permitted to satirize. That's a weapon reserved for higher ranks. You're here to prove that you can be trusted, not to embarrass the school, or yourself, or a noble with fragile self-esteem. Then comes Macfuamid, the poetic teenager. You've earned the right to perform longer works, to recite sections of genealogies, to begin composing your own verses, under supervision, of course. It's like handling fire while someone watches with a bucket of water nearby. You're still not considered dangerous, but people begin to listen more carefully. If you're too good, older bards will notice, and not always kindly. They'll smile as they correct you in public. They'll praise you while subtly pointing out your flaws. It's a test, always a test, and you're never quite sure if they want you to pass or fail. As you climb, the expectations grow heavier. With each rank, you're required to learn more poetic forms, over 300 total by the time you reach the top. Each one with specific syllable counts, meter patterns, alliteration schemes, and rules so convoluted they feel like divine punishment. You're expected not just to memorize them, but to live in them, to think in them, to breathe in structured rhythm. A single misstep in public can signal to others that you're not ready for the rank you wear, and that makes you vulnerable. Because in this world, everyone is listening, and no one forgets. At Anruth, things begin to shift. This is the rank where real danger begins. You're permitted to compose original works without oversight. Your words can now shape political decisions. You're sometimes sent alone to represent your school. You carry the weight of your institution with every syllable you utter, and your verses are no longer harmless. A praise poem from you might win a chieftain allies, or enrage a rival clan. A clumsy satire could unravel a treaty or provoke a feud. And if you get it wrong, no one will say, "Well, he's still learning." They'll say you weren't ready, that you should have known better, that your school has grown lax, and you may find yourself dropped a rank, or dropped entirely. At the top sits the Ollum, the master poet, the living archive, the poetic judge, the walking legal precedent. To reach this rank means you've passed every test, recited every form, survived every feast without scandal, and performed flawlessly under pressure time and time again. You've memorized not just poems, but encyclopedic histories, mythic genealogies, legal exceptions, and sacred verse. You are expected to guide kings, arbitrate disputes between rival schools, and train the next generation of poets without letting them see how exhausted you are. The Ollum holds a seat of honour at any court, and yet he is still not safe, because when you speak with such weight, every word has a shadow. The climb between ranks is not linear. There is no guarantee of promotion. Advancement comes at the discretion of your master, your school, or the judgment of a public audience. Sometimes it's political, other times it's petty. You might be held back not for lack of skill, but because an older bard doesn't like your style, or your lineage, or the way you smiled during his last recital. Public performance is your trial, and it never ends. You recite to prove your worth, again and again, in smoky halls packed with nobles, rivals, and drunk listeners who will remember exactly where you hesitated in stanza 4. And remember, this isn't theatre. You don't get applause. You get silence. You get judgment. You get nods if you're lucky, and an invitation to stay another night if you're truly excellent. If you falter, the room doesn't boo. It just doesn't speak. No one mocks you openly. They don't have to. The next morning you'll find the invitation rescinded, the stew a little colder, the next performance handed to someone else. Reputation is oxygen in the bardic world, and a single bad verse can choke you out before you realise it's happening. The pressure is constant, not just from above, but from beside you. Rival poets travel the same circuits. You see them at every feast, every contest, every seasonal gathering of schools. They greet you warmly, they drink with you, they laugh at your jokes, and they are waiting for you to forget a word, to flub a rhyme, to contradict a lineage. Every mistake you make becomes a weapon they can use in their next recital. And if you're too good, they'll find a way to cut you down anyway. Not by slandering you directly, that would be a crime, but by questioning the authenticity of your memory, by comparing you unfavourably to your master, by reminding the audience of your low birth or your youth or the fact that you once mispronounced a king's name 3 years ago at a harvest feast in Connaught. You learn to walk with armour you can't see. You polish your memory until it gleams like a blade. You review your verses daily, even the ones you hope never to recite again. You perform in your head constantly, in your sleep while walking, while waiting for food. Every word must be ready, every pause calibrated, because somewhere in the crowd, someone is listening not to admire you, but to catch you slipping. And through it all, you keep climbing. Not because you crave the status, though that helps. Not because the clothing gets nicer or the pay improves, though it often does. You climb because if you stop, you fall. And falling isn't just shame, it's social death. A bard who fails to advance becomes a cautionary tale. A bard who falls in public becomes a ghost. So you climb, carefully, relentlessly. Because the only thing more dangerous than rising is staying still. By now, you've earned your rank. Your name carries weight, your verses carry consequences, and your tongue has become both invitation and threat, which means you no longer stay in one place for long. You've joined the circuit now, the endless rotation of noble halls and chieftain courts that expect your presence, fear your judgment, and know they must host you whether they want to or not. Hospitality isn't a kindness in this world, it's an obligation, and bards like you are both guests and loaded weapons wrapped in cloaks of courtesy. Under Brean law, refusing a bard hospitality is dangerous. It's a breach of status and social code. If a noble household turns you away, they risk more than embarrassment. They risk satire. And not just any satire, but the kind that travels faster than rumour and lasts longer than memory. A well-placed verse can ruin a reputation, mock an entire lineage, or imply things about a family's honour that no one will dare refute aloud. So they welcome you. They offer you the best meat, the strongest drink, the warmest seat. Their smiles are wide, their hands generous. But the tension in the air is unmistakable. You're not a guest, you're a test. Every hall you enter has its own power struggle. You can feel it in the way people speak to one another, in the way they watch you. You learn to read rooms faster than any monk deciphers scripture. You spot the subtle glances, the forced laughter, the small silences after certain names are mentioned. You're expected to perform, yes, but you're also expected to notice. You're meant to witness slights, to absorb local scandals, to assess which children have been legitimised and which haven't. Your presence validates the host's status, but your verses also become a record. And everyone wants to make sure you record the version of events that suits them best. Feasting is never just feasting. You sit near the high table close enough to be noticed, but never quite trusted. They ply you with gifts, jewellery, cloaks, horses, even land. These aren't bribes, of course. No one would insult you by suggesting you could be bought. They're honours, tokens of respect, but everyone knows what they really mean. You're being paid not to write anything unflattering, to leave out that unfortunate jewel, to focus your praise on the victories and gloss over the suspiciously timed illnesses that cleared someone's path to succession. You nod, you smile, you drink their wine and memorise their secrets. And yet, you're expected to be honest, or at least appear so. A bard who praises too easily is dismissed as a flatterer. Your praise must be earned, must sound like it was wrung from your reluctant approval. You learn to strike a balance, gracious but not obsequious, generous but not careless. You praise their hospitality, their lineage, their generosity. You avoid their military record unless it's truly unimpeachable. You do not lie, but you do rearrange, reshape, reframe. You become a master of a mission, and everyone in the room knows it. The danger doesn't lie in what you say aloud. It lies in what people think you might say next. If your verses suggest insult, even indirectly, your host may grow cold. If you ask too many questions, they might question your loyalty. If you linger too long in one lord's court, their rivals will wonder where your true allegiances lie. You're a guest, yes, but one who could easily become a liability. So you learn to leave early, to accept gifts politely, then move on before the atmosphere curdles. Because when it does, it curdles fast. You've known bards who misjudged the moment, who performed a satire they thought clever, only to find themselves escorted out by men with polite smiles and very large knives. You've heard of those who vanished on the road between courts, robbed by bandits, they say, though no one seems to know which bandits. You've attended feasts where the laughter at your poem was just a little too forced, the clapping a little too delayed. You've seen generosity turn to menace in the span of a heartbeat. Because while the law may protect you, the road does not. Once you're between courts, you're just a traveller with an expensive cloak and too many enemies. And even within the halls themselves, accidents happen. A spoiled dish, a slip on the stairs, a horse that bolts unexpectedly. You learn to travel light, trust few, and sleep lightly. You learn which cooks are loyal and which servants speak too much. You keep your verses sharp and your exits sharper. It's not all tension and threat. There are nights when the fire is warm, the food rich and the company generous. There are patrons who truly respect you, who want to be remembered well, not just flattered. You compose verses that move a room to silence, that make warriors weep and women glance away to hide their expressions. In those moments, you feel the weight of your craft. You are not merely a performer. You are the voice of history, the conscience of a people, the living bridge between past and present. And for a moment, that burden feels like something close to pride. But you don't linger on that feeling. Pride is dangerous, so is comfort. The moment you begin to believe you're safe, you forget that you're never truly welcome, only tolerated, feared, and occasionally adored. You keep moving, from court to court, hall to hall, feast to feast. You know your schedule down to the season. Spring in Connaught, summer in Ulster, winter in the south, if you're lucky. You carry your verses like weapons, your memories like maps, and your name like a shield. Because in the end, that's all that protects you, your reputation. Not your status, not the laws. Just a whispered understanding that if you vanish, someone will ask questions, that your school will respond, that your last verses will not be kind. So they smile and pour you another drink. They gift you a silver brooch and tell you to return soon. And you nod, knowing you probably won't. Knowing that next season, someone else will host you, and someone else will wonder what you've seen. The hall is always too quiet just before you begin. Dozens of men, armed, proud, half-drunk, fully dangerous, sit shoulder to shoulder on benches that creak under the weight of their egos. The fire spits behind you. The smells of roasted meat, sweat, and spilled ale cling to the air. You feel your heart beat in your throat, not because you're unprepared, but because you know what's at stake. Every performance is a test. Every recital is a gauntlet. This is not entertainment, it is trial by verse. You cannot falter. Not a single word out of place, not a syllable miscounted. Your verses are bound by ancient rules so precise they make architecture look loose. Syllable count, alliteration, internal rhyme, end rhyme, tone. It must all unfold exactly as the form demands. The structure matters as much as the content. To misplace a line is not just an error, it's an insult to the tradition, to your school and to your audience. And worse, it can be taken as a personal slight to your patron, who is listening not for beauty, but for signs of loyalty, respect, or hidden satire. And don't think they'll forgive you for nerves. You're not some novice with a harp, plucking out sweet nothings in a corner. You are the living record of your people. You are the vessel of memory, law, history, and insult. You've been trained for this moment for over a decade, so when your voice cracks, or your timing slips, or your memory stumbles on a name in a genealogy, the audience does not murmur in sympathy. They go still. The energy in the room turns cold. Your failure ripples outward, first to you, then to your patron, then to the school that certified your rank. In one breath, you can discredit a lineage. And there are always witnesses, other bards, poets with smiles too polite, sipping wine with the smugness of men waiting for your slip. Some have memorized your usual material just in case. Some will recite your mistake the next day in a different hall, phrased as a cautionary tale. You won't be named directly, of course. That would be ungenerous, but the story will include enough detail to identify you, and the damage will spread faster than any praise you've ever earned. You learn quickly. The only thing bards love more than a flawless performance is a well-timed downfall. It doesn't matter if you're ill, or exhausted, or grieving the death of someone you loved. You perform. You perform in winter feasts when your voice is hoarse from smoke and frost. You perform in plague years when you wonder if you'll live long enough to be remembered. You perform after days on horseback with an empty stomach, and you do so with perfect posture and careful diction, because anything less is failure, and failure is remembered. Sometimes your patron gives you a subject on the spot, an event that just happened, a new alliance, a marriage, a victory. You have a few minutes, maybe an hour, to compose a formal verse worthy of public recital. You must recall the proper poetic form, select the right tone, and construct a piece that flatters without sounding hollow. You are expected to be spontaneous and polished, flattering but not servile, clever but never cruel, unless cruelty has been requested. And even then, it must be elegant, never bludgeon when a scalpel will do. You learn the art of pacing. You pause where the rhythm demands it. You let silence fall after a line that carries weight. You modulate your voice just enough to hold the room's attention. Every breath is calculated, every gesture rehearsed. You're not simply reciting, you're performing survival. This is theatre where failure isn't measured in bad reviews, but in lost respect, revoked patronage, or, if you truly offend the wrong person, violence. There's no second chance, no do-over, just the weight of expectation pressing down on you like an anvil balanced on your ribcage. And your audience? They don't make it easy. Some interrupt. Some test you by murmuring lines under their breath to throw off your rhythm. Some demand longer pieces, harder forms, or spontaneous composition. Some simply stare, daring you to fail. The most dangerous are the ones who smile and seem pleased, until you realise, hours later, that your wording accidentally slighted their grandfather. You never know which line will be the one that tips a listener from approval to offence. You also perform for rival courts, courts that support your enemies, courts that barely tolerate your presence, courts that have already decided whether you're useful or disposable. But there, your task is even harder. Impress without aligning, charm without compromising, speak without misstepping. You must leave a mark without leaving blood behind. You craft every word like a man carving a bridge over a chasm, with the knowledge that one false chisel could bring it all crashing down. Over time, you develop instincts. You begin to sense when a line needs softening, when a joke has gone too far, when a metaphor veers toward insult. You adapt mid-recital, your mind running parallel tracks. One for the verses, one for the audience. You learn to feel the tension in the room and adjust like a ship trimming its sails in rising wind. You perform through illness, heartbreak, fear, and grief, because there is no other choice, because the only thing worse than stumbling is silence. And yet, when it works, when the verses flow, when the form holds, when the crowd leans forward in unison, you feel something close to invincibility. Not joy exactly, not pride, just the cold satisfaction of surviving another performance, of being sharper than the sword on a warrior's hip, of knowing that your voice held a room full of armed men in absolute stillness, if only for a few minutes. You walk off not with applause but with measured nods, with the refilling of your cup, with invitations whispered from corners. In your world, that is victory. But you don't linger in it. You finish your meal, you gather your things, and you prepare to perform again tomorrow, Because perfection doesn't build reputation. Consistency does. You're only as good as your last recital, and there's always someone waiting for you to slip. Your voice is never neutral. That illusion dies the first time a rival lord stares a little too long after your performance. In theory, you're impartial, a servant of memory and tradition, above the squabbles of the powerful. But in practice, every word you speak is weighted. Every name you include or exclude says something. You cannot write for everyone, and someone always notices who you chose to remember. In a land where pride is armour and reputation is currency, your silence is often louder than your verse. Praise is a currency, and you spend it at your own risk. Sing of a chieftain's honour, and his enemies will take note. Mention a nobleman's courage in battle, and those he bested will assume you've chosen a side. Repeat a story told to you in confidence, no matter how flattering, and suddenly you're no longer a guest but a spy. Even your compliments can become weapons in someone else's feud. You might not know the full history behind the verse, but your audience certainly does. Every syllable is a blade, and you're not always holding the handle. You're expected to praise your host, that much is understood. You're fed, clothed, protected. The exchange is old as the hills, hospitality for poetry. But how much praise is too much? Make your poem too glowing, and it reeks of desperation. Keep it too modest, and it suggests disapproval. You're walking a tightrope with no net, each line calibrated to flatter just enough, without inviting accusations of flattery. Because once you're seen as a partisan, your credibility begins to rot. Your verses become propaganda, your name a badge of bias. And your school? They don't take kindly to bards who tarnish the institution. There's another problem, quieter but more dangerous: omission. The names you don't speak, the battles you don't mention, the marriages you forget. These absences are noted just as carefully as your words. Leave out a nobleman's victory, and it's seen as a slight. Neglect a family's genealogy in your recital, and suddenly you're accused of questioning their legitimacy. It doesn't matter if the omission was accidental. It rarely is. They assume purpose, and in this world, purpose is power. You find yourself maintaining lists in your head, not just of names and events, but of who must never be left out. Sometimes you're ordered not to speak. There are men too controversial to mention, families whose rise to power is still fresh and fragile, past lords whose names evoke uncomfortable memories. You are told which names are off limits, which histories must be reshaped, which verses are no longer to be sung. You comply, you adjust, you rewrite history, not because you want to, but because you must. And then you remember that others are watching, listeners who know what should have been said, who note the erasures and wonder what they mean. In trying to protect yourself, you've created a new danger. The worst part is how quickly praise becomes poison. A lord who welcomed you 10 years ago, who showered you with gifts and smiled at your performances, may now be out of favour, or dead. The verses you composed for him still live in your mouth, and every time you recite them, you reopen old wounds. You might not mean to, but others will hear your words as loyalty to the past, or worse, as defiance of the present. That's the problem with memory. It lingers longer than politics allow, and you can't erase what you once sang, even when it turns against you. So you begin to self-censor. You speak less. You compose verses that are elegant but vague, poetic but forgettable. You avoid specifics. You recycle old praise, modifying it just enough to suit the next patron. You become skilled at generalization. You praise courage without saying whose. You speak of honour without attaching it to any particular act. Your goal is no longer immortality, it's survival, and the safest words are the ones no one remembers clearly. This doesn't mean you've grown cowardly, just careful. You still perform, you still compose, but the fire has cooled. The clever lines that once made rooms erupt with laughter or ghosts still with awe now feel like liabilities. You hoard them in your mind, saving them for moments when the risk is worth it. Most of the time, it isn't. You've seen too many bards undone by one clever phrase delivered to the wrong room. You've heard the stories, the satire that accidentally exposed a king's secret, the praise poem that reignited an old feud. Words live longer than intentions. You begin to envy the dead. Their verses are fixed, their alliances are frozen. They don't have to navigate shifting loyalties or guess which noble family is about to fall. Their reputations are secure, even if their bodies are dust. Yours is constantly in flux, as fragile as parchment in the rain. You are judged not just by what you say, but by how it's interpreted, reinterpreted, and misremembered. A single line from a decade ago can be dragged into the present and used against you, twisted out of context by someone eager to bring you down. And yet, you cannot stop. Your silence would be just as dangerous. If you fall too quiet, people will assume you're withholding something. That you know a secret. That you're planning a satire. You become a walking threat whether you speak or not. Praise one king too much, and you're accused of partiality. Praise none at all, and you're seen as bitter, dangerous, or worse, irrelevant. You're trapped in a paradox, visible enough to remain powerful, vague enough to remain safe. So you adapt. You keep your tone balanced, your language diplomatic, your memory selective. You remember not just the lineages and deeds of others, but the emotional weather of each court. Who feuded with whom? Which deaths are still raw, which rumours never quite faded? You use this knowledge to navigate, to survive, to shape verses like a smith tempers steel, always aware of the heat and tension around you. In time, you stop hoping for admiration. You aim instead for respect, for a kind of quiet immunity. You want to be the bard who speaks beautifully but carefully, who praises without entangling himself, who remembers everything but says just enough. The one they invite back year after year, not because he's beloved, but because he's dangerous in a way no one wants to provoke. Your goal is no longer fame. It's to be indispensable and untouchable. And that is the curse. You speak for others, but never fully for yourself. Your words must always serve, deflect, protect, and perform. And if you've done your job right, no one will remember exactly what you said, only that they clapped politely, offered you more wine, and didn't feel the need to draw their sword. You've already seen what satire can do to a king. One well-aimed verse and his honour buckles, his legacy shrinks, his rivals circle like hounds. But satire isn't only for kings. Sometimes it's aimed at someone who can fire back. Welcome to the bardic duel. You meet your rival in a hall. Maybe you've never seen them before, or maybe you've been circling each other for years. Two schools, two styles, two egos sharpened to a point. The air is tense, not from swords drawn, but from silences held too long. You've been summoned not to fight, but to entertain. But everyone knows what this really is, a contest of memory, wit, and reputation. No blood, just ruin. You take your place, so does your opponent. You recite first or second, depending on rank, on hospitality, or on the whims of your host. The crowd is already watching too closely. They smell drama. And in a culture where law lives in verse, where insult has legal standing, and where memory lasts longer than paper, this isn't posturing. This is dangerous. You don't insult plainly. That would be childish. You weave it in the verse. You hint. You insinuate. You compare your rival to a limp goose, to a forgotten grain sack, to a man so unmemorable, even his shadow yawns. You keep the metre perfect, the alliteration crisp, the internal rhymes so tight they could cut stone. The more elegant the attack, the more deadly. And the crowd, they roar or wince depending on who they think will win. Then your opponent steps up. Maybe they smile, maybe they don't. Their response is quicker than you expected, smoother. It hits below the rib, not loud, but deep. They mention your master, the verse you once flubbed at a noble's wedding. That time you got too drunk in Ulster and praised the wrong prince. It's all there, dressed in rhythm and metaphor, and you feel the warmth of your own blood rising in your cheeks, even before the last line falls. It's not enough to be clever. You have to be sharp and accurate. Slipping up, getting a lineage wrong, mispronouncing a key name, fumbling your rhythm means you lose. Not just the contest, but face, status, reputation. In bardic lore, a verbal defeat could stain your school for years. If you're seen as sloppy, cowardly, or, worst of all, humorless, no one will hire you. You won't be trusted. The next time your name is mentioned in a noble court, it will be as a warning. Don't bring him in. He stutters when provoked. And yes, it's usually him, but not always. There were women trained in bardic forms, rarer, less recorded, and treated as curiosities by later scribes. But they existed, and in a duel, if she stood her ground and held her verse, she was as feared as any man with a better title. The duel doesn't always end with a winner. Sometimes, both poets finish without humiliation. A draw, mutual respect, or at least mutual exhaustion. But the crowd remembers the sting of one line, the brilliance of one closing image, and whispers begin. One of you will leave the hall stronger. The other will feel it. Maybe not yet, but soon, when fewer gifts come your way and the invitations dry up. The irony, of course, is that this performance doesn't always reflect who's truly the better poet. It reflects who was better that night, who read the room, who had the sharper memory, the steadier breath, the nerve to push just far enough without tipping into self-sabotage. It's not art, it's survival. You're not here to express yourself, you're here to win. Later, back in your lodging, you replay every line. The ones that hit, the ones that didn't. You think of what you could have said. You think of the face of your opponent when your second stanza landed clean, and the ripple of laughter that followed. You think of the silence at the end, and whether it meant awe or apathy. You hope someone important was impressed. Because this wasn't just fun. This was your livelihood, your name, your standing in the eyes of rival schools and restless lords. One duel doesn't define a career, but a few bad ones in a row can end one. And you know more than one bard who retired early after a particularly disastrous exchange. Retired meaning vanished, or was invited to vanish. In the end, you know this. Satire may kill a king's honour, but it can destroy a bard outright. Because when your weapon is words, you're never truly safe from someone sharper. You are, by all accounts, inviolable. The law says so. The custom says so. The stories say so. A bard is sacred like a relic, like a monk, like a fragment of living law wrapped in a cloak and a reputation. You're not to be harmed, insulted, struck, detained, or even seriously inconvenienced. To attack a bard is to attack memory itself, and the consequences are steep. Legal penalties, social ruin, even spiritual retribution in some tellings. You walk into courts with the assurance that no blade will be drawn against you. Or at least, that's how it's supposed to be. But the world doesn't always care what it's supposed to be. Your safety, like everything else in your profession, is a performance. People respect you because they fear your voice. They fear what you might say. They fear what others will think if they're seen mistreating you. That fear is powerful, but not absolute. All it takes is one man who believes your silence is worth more than your satire. One noble whose pride outweighs his concern for consequence. One jealous rival who doesn't mind hiding the blood on his hands as long as your mouth stays shut. The law can't protect you if you disappear on the road. It can't unpoison your wine. And it certainly can't undo a knife in the ribs, delivered quietly in a hallway after a performance that cut too close to the bone. So you learn to watch the edges of the room. You study body language with the same care you give to your verse forms. You know when a laugh is forced, when a toast is too generous, when the air in a feast hall goes thin and brittle. You leave early when you can. You avoid staying too long in courts where the walls have ears and the silence stretches too wide. And when you recite a satire, or worse, deliver a truth veiled in compliment, you do so with every escape route in mind. The stories you heard as a student begin to feel less like warnings and more like statistics. The bard who fell into the river the morning after mocking a chieftain's battle tactics. The young poet whose clever genealogy accidentally undermined a marriage alliance and was later lost to wolves. The master bard who vanished between one court and another, last seen departing with a smiling escort, who returned alone. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows. Sacred is not the same as safe. It doesn't have to be murder either. Violence comes in subtler forms. Your patronage can dry up overnight. Invitations cease. Feasts go on without your presence. You find yourself on the wrong side of a whisper campaign. Your memory questioned, your loyalty doubted. You begin to receive fewer gifts, fewer courtesies. A seat near the fire becomes a seat by the door. No one says you're being punished, but you are. And the law is not written to protect you from neglect. That kind of harm is slow, silent, and just as lethal. You might think your fellow poets would close ranks, but even that's uncertain. The bardic community is close-knit, but it's also competitive. If you fall, someone else rises. They may mourn you, yes, but only once it's clear you're not getting back up. And if your fall comes from your own sharp tongue, well, wasn't that the risk all along? They'll remember you fondly, quote your best lines, shake their heads at the tragedy. Then they'll move on, a little more careful than before, but no less hungry for attention. What protects you, in the end, isn't the law, it's your usefulness. As long as you're valuable, respected, feared, entertaining, strategic, people will keep you close. They'll offer you gifts. They'll listen to your words. They'll nod when you recite the ancient histories and pour you another drink when you sit down. But if that value begins to fade, if your performances falter, if your memory slips, if your latest verses land poorly, then the calculations change. A bard who can no longer sing is just a man in expensive robes, and no one weeps long for those. So you invest in your own protection. You cultivate allies. You memorize debts. You never accept a gift without remembering who gave it, when and why. You help when it's low risk, and observe when it isn't. You know which warriors are fond of your satire, and which tolerate it. You never travel entirely alone. Even when you appear to, there's always someone who owes you a favour nearby. And you carry the unspoken threat that if anything happens to you, your school will respond. Not with swords, but with stories. Because that's your only real weapon. Memory? Reputation? Legacy? The belief that harming a bard will live longer in infamy than the bard himself. You nurture that myth like a flame in winter. You let people believe that you'll be remembered, that your words will echo, that your enemies will become the punchlines of future recitals. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. It keeps you breathing. Still, there are moments when even the best precautions feel like paper armour. A pause too long after a performance, a stare that lingers, a silence that shouldn't stretch quite that far. You carry on. You finish your verses. You drink the wine that's handed to you and smile at the Lord, whose pride you've just tested. Because to hesitate would be to admit fear. And fear, once seen, is blood in the water. You're sacred, yes, but only as long as it suits those in power. The moment you threaten more than you entertain, that sanctity becomes negotiable. You are a holy object in a pagan court, respected, revered, and entirely disposable. And you know this. You've always known. It's why you keep your verses sharp and your bags packed. Why you sleep lightly and speak more carefully than you ever let on. You survive not because you're untouchable, but because most people still believe it would be a mistake to try. And so, Each time you walk into a new hall, you carry the silence of the bards who didn't make it. You recite their names occasionally, subtly, in reference, a caution and a tribute. Not because you want to mourn them, but because you want to remind everyone listening, you remember. And remembering in your world is power. There's a moment, usually late at night, after a feast has quieted, when you feel the weight settle in your chest. Not the weight of food or wine or travel, but of memory. It presses behind your eyes like a storm cloud, heavy and vast and impossible to explain. You lie on a straw mattress or a carved bench or sometimes the cold ground, and it all starts bubbling up. The names, the dates, the rhymes, the grudges, the betrayals. Things you didn't mean to remember, things no one asked you to keep. But they're in there, every syllable, every sigh stuck like seeds between your teeth. You weren't taught how to carry this. You were taught how to gather it, how to shape it, how to preserve it, but no one told you how much of it there would be, or how permanent it would feel. Every poem you composed is still there. Every legal tract, every satirical jab, every genealogy and heroic tale, indexed in the corners of your mind, like shelves in a fireproof library. You are the archive, the official version, and that means you are never allowed to forget, even when forgetting would be easier, even when forgetting would be kind. You remember deaths that others have grieved and moved past, not just the names of the dead, but the dates, the songs sung at the wake, the alliances forged at the funeral feast. You remember whose absence led to which feud. You remember the first lines of laments that haven't been spoken aloud in a decade. You recall the expressions on the faces of those who mourned and those who didn't. This isn't empathy, it's obligation. No one else remembers, so you have to, even when it hurts, even when it becomes too much. Treaties are worse, not because they're painful, but because they're maddening in their precision. You remember the wording of oaths sworn between men who are now enemies. You remember the promises made in candlelight, the handshakes, the ritual gifts. And you remember when those promises were broken, when a cousin invaded land he once swore to protect, when a marriage alliance dissolved into bitter silence. You carry these contradictions in your mind like broken pottery you aren't allowed to throw away. And when someone asks, didn't he swear to keep peace until the harvest? You don't even hesitate. You recite the exact line, in the exact meter, and the room goes quiet. The insults never fade. You'd think they would. The petty barbs, the quick-witted jabs exchanged over mead. But they're the sharpest. They cut a groove into your memory that never heals. You remember what was said, by whom, in what tone, and to what effect. You remember the way a crowd laughed or didn't. You remember who stormed out. You remember which verse got a man exiled, and which one was later repeated in jest by his enemies. You didn't mean to keep it all, but once a word is heard by a bard, it lives forever. You become the keeper of grudges you didn't even know you inherited. It's not just events and people. You carry language itself, the rhythms of ancient forms, the quirks of dialects from one province to the next, archaic terms, poetic inversions, idioms so old that even the elders tilt their heads when you speak them aloud. You dream in meter sometimes. You wake up with a half rhyme on your tongue and no memory of where it came from. You can't listen to ordinary conversation without rearranging it in your head, wondering how it would scan as verse. You correct people silently, not out of pride, but because your mind doesn't know how to stop. Some days, the weight feels noble. You walk through a court and people bow. They ask you questions no one else can answer. You recite a piece of forgotten law, and two clans avoid bloodshed. You perform a verse that reunites a family or salvages a treaty. You feel useful, revered, respected. But those moments are brief. Most of the time, you carry all of this knowledge alone, with no way to set it down. People want you to remember for them, but they don't want to know what that means. They see the cloak, the voice, the verses. They don't see the cost. And the cost is simple. You are never truly present. You live in the past constantly. When you hear a name, your mind fills with context, dates, connections, events. You can't meet someone without silently passing their ancestry. You can't sit at a feast without hearing echoes of the last one, or the last 100. The present is never clean. It's always overlaid with memory, layered like palimpsest, impossible to ignore. You laugh at a joke and then remember that the man who told it once betrayed a king. You enjoy a song and then recall the satirical version sung after a massacre. Nothing stays innocent. Nothing stays new. You try not to let it show. You keep your posture straight, your tone measured, your recitation smooth, but inside it hums constantly. A noise that never turns off. You find yourself going still for long stretches, staring at nothing, while your mind sorts through events no one asks you to revisit. You rehearse verses you haven't performed in years just to keep them intact. You practice names in your head, like prayer beads, terrified that forgetting even one will break something you've sworn to preserve. You wonder if this is what aging will be for you. Not forgetting, but drowning in things everyone else has already let go. And there is no release. You cannot write it down and walk away. You cannot retire. Even when your voice fades, even when your body begins to fail, people will still come to you with questions. They'll still ask for recitations, for clarification, for context. You'll still be expected to remember. And when you finally do forget, when a name slips, when a detail blurs, they will look at you with quiet alarm. Not because they blame you, but because they realize what you carry is mortal. That when you go, it goes with you. You don't get to forget. That's the bargain. You are chosen for your memory, trained to hold what others cannot. You are a vessel, a living reliquary. And that sounds noble until you realize what a reliquary actually is. A container for the dead. Eventually, like everyone else, you die. There's no grand farewell, no final performance, no dramatic last verse. Maybe it's an illness, a fever that doesn't break. Maybe a quiet fall on a rainy road. Maybe you simply stop waking. However it happens, your body is burned or buried, your name marked in a ledger, your death noted politely at a gathering. And the world carries on. The court shifts. The feast begins. The next bard rises. You're gone. But your words remain. Not all of them. Never all of them. Most vanish like smoke. Lines you only spoke once. Names you recited to men who died before you did. But the others, the ones that mattered, the ones that were written down or remembered, those stay. Your praise poems echo in new voices. Your genealogies are cited in arguments over land and marriage. Your satire lives on the tongues of young poets who don't know your face, but know your phrasing. You're no longer a person. You're a verse, a pattern, a precedent. People quote you without knowing they're quoting you. A noble recites your line in a speech, unaware it once stirred a room to laughter before turning a chieftain's face cold. A student practicing their meter stumbles through your phrasing, adjusting breath and tone, shaping their voice to match yours without ever realizing they're tracing your path. You've become anonymous in the way that all influence does. Dispersed, unclaimed, useful. You shaped reputations that outlived you. The ones you praised are still remembered, flawed perhaps, but elevated. You built their public image line by line, and now they stand taller in memory than they ever did in life. You helped solidify their myth. You're part of the reason their names remain on stone, in song, in court. And the ones you mocked, they remain too, but smaller, reduced, their names recalled with a wince or a chuckle, always accompanied by the tone you gave them. You didn't carry a sword, but your tongue cut through lineage like steel. You didn't spill blood, but you reshaped history with couplets. The verses that outlast you aren't always the ones you cared for. The best lines are forgotten. The careful works The elegant structures, the compositions you laboured over, many disappear. But the biting phrase from that one feast, the sharp quip at a rival bard's expense, the satirical twist on a noble's title, those survive. Short, memorable, useful. Your legacy is not the archive you kept in your mind. It's what others found convenient to pass on. Some of your work is misquoted, some is distorted. Over time, people forget what you meant and twist your meaning into something else. That clever metaphor becomes a weapon in someone else's argument. That cautionary satire is turned into mockery by a less subtle hand. You're cited in feuds you never witnessed, invoked in poems you would have rewritten. But there's no correcting it, no protest, no authority to reclaim. You're not here, you're not watching. What you said lives on, but it no longer belongs to you. And yet, despite everything, there is a kind of permanence in that loss. You gave shape to things. That shape persists. The boundary stones you described in verse are still used in land disputes. The names you listed in court are still traced by scribes verifying bloodlines. A young bard trying to impress their master performs your metre with only a vague idea of its source. You became part of the structure. Not honoured, necessarily, but embedded. Foundational. You aren't remembered as a person. No one recalls your laugh, your gait, your face after a long journey. No one knows what made you hesitate, or which poem you regretted, or which court frightened you more than you ever admitted. Those parts of you are gone. But someone remembers the verse you wrote that made a king pause before declaring war. Someone still hears the rhythm you carried through a satire that kept a fool from rising too high. You're not present, but you're still there, in the cracks of memory, in the breath between stanzas. Your school remembers you, if only in fragments. Your name might be recited during training, your most famous poem dissected in a classroom filled with bored apprentices. You become a footnote, a cautionary example, a benchmark, and that's enough. You were always meant to vanish eventually. The goal was never to last, but to last through others. And you do. In the end, it isn't your face that's passed down. It's your cadence. A line recited here, a form mimicked there, a phrase muttered at a feast, half as a joke, half as a threat. And no one remembers the moment you wrote it or why, but it fits, it works, it remains. That's what it means to be a bard. You don't live forever, but your voice, trimmed, borrowed, half-remembered, does. That brings us to the end of tonight's story. If you're still awake, thank you for walking the rain-soaked roads of early Ireland with me, for reciting in firelit halls, for remembering the burden of too many names, and for bearing witness to a life built entirely from words. If you'd like early access to more of these slow, heavy histories, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to help keep the stories going, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with other forgotten lives you'd like to see uncovered. And if you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps others find their way to these stories. Sleep well.